The writer and educator Will Durant once wrote, "Every science begins as philosophy and ends as art."
Welcome to the A&P Professor, a few minutes to focus on teaching human anatomy and physiology with host Kevin Patton.
This episode has updates in how we inherit red hair, how we build the somatosensory body map, and I answer a question about frequency of tests and exams in the A&P course. In my A&P course, the very first human body system that we start talking about is the integumentary system, the skin. And there are many reasons why that works out really well, but one of them is that the skin is the organ, and the integumentary system is the organ system that is most familiar to everybody, I think. I mean, we see our skin all the time, we interact with our skin a lot, so it makes a good starting point. And, part of this whole system is the hair. And there's a lot of variation in hair color and hair texture and so on. And that often piques the curiosity of our students. And they know that it has a lot to do with genetics. And, a lot of times their background in genetics is very basic. And, the classic way of looking at these sorts of traits is to think about this gene or this version of a gene and that version of a gene that's going to control this trait or that trait. But we're finding out that hair color inheritance is controlled by a number of different genes. Just like most complex traits in the human body, we're finding out more and more that there are more and more genes involved. As a matter of fact, there's an emerging idea called the omnigenic model, which states that all complex traits that are inherited are controlled by all the genes. Either directly or indirectly, all the genes have some input in the expression of any complex trait that we have in the body, and that would include possibly or probably hair color. Now, red hair is something that has been of interest to the human race for a long time, I think, and certainly recently in terms of its inheritance. And you may have heard that there is a gene called MC1R that is a single gene that has recently been thought to control red hair color. But there's some newer research that shows that, it's not so simple, that it's more of a polygenic or perhaps even omnigenic effect going on here with red hair. So those previous studies, they showed that redheads inherit, two versions of that MC1R gene. And so having those two MC1R genes is what leads to having red hair. So one comes from their mother and one comes from their father. And just about everybody with red hair does have two copies of that red-haired version of MC1R. But not everyone carrying two red-haired versions of MC1R ends up actually being a redhead. So we kind of knew all along that there must be other genes involved, but we didn't really know which genes or what their involvement was. But some researchers at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland have looked at DNA from 350,000 people. That's a lot, who had taken part in the United Kingdom Biobank study. They were looking at this inheritance of hair color, particularly red hair, and they were okay with studying, people that were mainly of European descent because that group has probably the greatest variation of hair color of any gene pool that they could have looked at. When they did the comparisons between redheads and people with brown hair, black hair, they identified 8 genes or genetic differences that hadn't been identified before, that were all associated with red hair. And they started looking at the function of those genes. And as they started looking into these things, they found that there were a couple of hundred genes associated with people with blonde hair and brunette hair. And, they really started identifying that there's a gradient of color from black through dark brown, light brown, different shades of blonde. Those are all a result from genetic differences among these couple hundred genes that they were looking at. Some of those genes actually trigger differences not just in hair color, but also hair texture and the growth of hair in terms of its curliness or its straightness, for example. So if you want to know more about the genes involved in hair color, as we know it right now, it's probably going to change in the next couple of years. That was published in Nature Communications, and I have a link to that in the show notes and the episode page at theapprofessor.org. But just stepping back from this for a moment, I want to emphasize the fact that when the inheritance of hair color comes up, I think this is a good opportunity to really enlighten students that complex characteristics like hair color are not as simple as those pea experiments of Gregor Mendel. It's not really just one gene or this gene, just a few different genes. There are hundreds of genes involved and hundreds of combinations. And there's a lot of things we don't know about yet. So hair color, along with skin color and other complex traits, is very, very complex. And it might even be a good opportunity to introduce the idea of polygenic traits and even the idea of omnigenic model of how genes work. A searchable transcript and a captioned audiogram of this episode are funded by AAA, the American Association of Anatomists, at anatomy.org. In my A&P course, when we get to the nervous system and eventually start talking about the various functions of the cortex and dive into that postcentral gyrus where the somatosensory center is, where we have usually in most diagrams in textbooks, charts, and so on, they'll have a little homunculus, that is a little miniature human that's all distorted because we have this sort of built-in body map where we can sense the different regions of our body. They're mapped out to different areas of that somatosensory cortex. And, it's kind of fun to look at that and compare and contrast, how much incoming sensory input we're getting from different parts of the body, where our lips, for example, are getting a lot, but our forehead not so much, or our fingertips are getting a lot of sensory information, but our elbow not so much. And that little homunculus, meaning that little miniature human diagram that's all distorted, it helps us understand that map and kind of picture in our mind's eye how that map works. And one of the things I like to talk about is the fact that a lot of that involves learning. We have to kind of figure out that map. We have to kind of connect this sensation in our fingertip with what's actually going on in the brain and actually start forming that. And some new information was just recently published in Scientific Reports, where researchers were measuring brain waves produced when newborn babies kick their limbs during their REM, that is the rapid eye movement stage of sleep. In doing these studies, they found out that a lot of that kicking that's going on, especially in the late stages of pregnancy in the third trimester, that helps grow areas of the brain that deal with that sensory input and help us make that map. And so we're really starting to get to the point where we're working out the mechanisms of how that map making in our brains work. So if you want more information, more detail on that, I have some links in the show notes and at the episode page at theapprofessor.org. But I think it's a good thing to kind of drop in there when we're discussing this in class, that there is this learning process involved, and that's going to really help us understand why a certain amount of activity in utero as well as infants is necessary for proper brain development so that our brains actually work the way we want them to work by the time we get older. Regular listeners of this podcast may have noticed that a few days before the last few episodes have come out, I released a brief preview episode ahead of time. And each of those preview episodes include a brief synopsis of what the upcoming topics are going to be in the full episode. And there might be an announcement or two related to the podcast. And then I usually have a few word dissections, just like we do with our students in class, where we pull apart some term that might relate in some way to something we're going to be talking about on the full episode, just to kind of get us into the mode of the language of science and medicine. And then I'll usually have one or two recommendations of books from the A&P Professor Book Club, books that you might find useful or interesting as an A&P teacher. So what I need to know is, are these helpful to you at all? Are they something you want to see continue, or are they something you'd rather do without? Is there some feature you'd like to see that I'm not doing? Is there something I'm doing that you'd rather I not do? So just let me know, and I sure would appreciate it. Hey, did you know that HAPS, the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society, is sponsoring a one-day regional meeting in Louisville this spring on March 30th? I've attended many HAPS regionals over the years, and they're great places to meet and network with others who do exactly what you do, teach human anatomy and physiology. Just go to theapprofessor.org/HAPS, that's HAPS, to find out more. Hey, guess what? We have a call on the podcast hotline.
Hi, Kevin. It's Krista Rumpolsky, one of your biggest listeners and biggest fans. I wanted to thank you for your preview episodes. I think they're very helpful to get an idea of what might be coming up that I need to plan to spend some time on. But also, what are the topics that are on your mind and what's emerging out there in the research? Your podcast covers a lot of those things, and I really appreciate that. If you have time in the future, I'd love to hear you talk about the standards or lack of standards out there in A&P education around the frequency of testing. I know that the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society has a HAPS exam, but from my experience, some organizations do a final that's comprehensive, some do a midterm that's comprehensive, some do multiple exams, some do many quizzes or none at all. Is this an area where there needs or should be any standards, especially with freshman students in A&P, or does that all fall under, what we call academic freedom and depends upon the audience? There's just a lot of debates about this topic, and I'm wondering, with all of your experience, what you think the sweet spot is in the frequency and the form of testing in your, imagine a freshman A&P student. Thanks so much, Kevin. Have a great day.
Hey, Krista. Thanks for the feedback on the preview episodes. It's gratifying to know that they're helpful. Now, regarding standards on frequency of testing, the answer is yes. I mean, no. Well, I don't know. Maybe. Okay, that's not much of an answer. And I'm happy to give an answer. But remember, it's just my answer, not the answer. I think there are at least two issues embedded here. The first one is there an ideal frequency of testing? And secondly, should HAPS or some other organization suggest standards for frequency of testing in the undergraduate A&P course? But before we get to those two central questions, I have a question. What do we mean by the term testing? Testing can mean a lot of different things. For example, how is a test different from an exam, or from a quiz, or from homework, or from practice problems, In my mind, these are all tests because they all test the ability of a student to retrieve and apply the content of our course accurately and meaningfully. So I'm going to approach this using that broad definition of testing. And here's another rhetorical question we should think about before we go any further with this. Is teaching an art or a science? Now, in my view, it's both. And Krista, I know you do research in learning science and strongly believe in evidence-based methods of teaching. And I share that belief. Learning science continues to inform us about the principles of how we learn and about the efficacy of various teaching and learning strategies. I think learning science helps us understand each of the various tools in our teacher's toolbox. And it helps us discover or invent new teaching tools. It helps us learn how to use each tool safely and effectively, and how to decide which tool or tools is best for which teaching and learning scenario. And that's where the art comes in. That is, in the choosing of teaching methods to meet particular goals with a particular set of students in a particular program, and in exactly how we're going to apply each of the methods we've chosen, and maybe even how to make specific modifications to help particular students with particular challenges. Okay, I haven't even started to answer the question, have I? I know this about myself. I tend to take so much time setting up my answer to just about any question that most folks have tuned out before I have a chance to give my answer. So for those few of you still with me, here it is. I don't think we can say that there's an ideal frequency of testing. But we can't leave it at that. I don't want to leave it at that. You don't want me to leave it at that, so I won't. First, what does the current literature of learning science say about frequency of testing? Well, right now it seems kind of mixed. I think what's clear is that frequent retrieval practice is a highly effective way to learn. And what is testing if not retrieval practice? So learning science says that a high frequency of testing is beneficial. But I don't think learning science is very clear on what exact form that testing should take in every course. And I doubt that it can, except in a very general sense. So I don't think that we can definitively say that there's a certain combination of homework, quizzes, tests, exams, and so on that will work best for everyone all the time. Partly because I think there's an art to it when we get to that level. And an art, by its nature, is aesthetic. It involves finding what is pleasing and beautiful. And because art is in the eye of the beholder, there's necessarily an element of individual sense of style, tastes, and balance, or disruption of balance in some cases. In my experience over several decades, I've been playing around a lot in the paint and clay of the art of teaching anatomy and physiology. I've had daily quizzes and weekly tests. I've had a midterm and final as the only test in a course. I've done all kinds of combinations of testing. And what that experience tells me is that I find my students do best when they're tested several times a week and when all the tests are cumulative. That's where I've found beauty for me and my students, where the outcomes are beautiful and pleasing to everyone. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. How does he have time to do anything else in class? And with all that grading, how does he have time to do anything else outside of class? Well, those are important questions. And as usual, I have several vague answers. One is automation. These days, we have available to us learning management systems and even third-party software that can test students in an automatic way. It tests them, it gives them immediate feedback, it can even assign grades and so on. It can point them to other resources and so on. So, it's up to us to set that up in a way that's appropriate for our students. So that takes some investment of time ahead of the game. But once it's in operation, it automates a lot of that grading process. So that frees up a lot of time. And because it's online, it doesn't all have to be done in class. It can be done outside of class. So that's going to free up my time as a grader, and it frees up the class time, amount of time spent in class on testing activities. And another issue is, what's a test really, as we said before? In-class activities such as solving case studies, or clicker questions during a lecture, or discussions, or concept map building. These are all forms of testing, right? So we can do frequent testing, although it doesn't always look like a test, and we don't always necessarily label it as a test. Now, as I mentioned in a previous episode, I have my students do a lot of online testing for a grade and have only 2 in-class formal written cumulative exams. And that works really well for me. But the thing is, I might experiment with something new I've learned from one of you and find something more beautiful to do with my art. And each of you will have your own beautiful art that you are making. Mine might be more of a Jackson Pollock thing, and yours more of a Rembrandt thing. But they can both be powerful and effective. So what I'm saying is that perhaps we can say that the ideal frequency of testing in an undergraduate A&P course is a pretty high frequency. And just leave it at that. Because if I recommend anything more specific, I'd be limiting your art, wouldn't I? And I do think it might be useful for HAPS or some other body to recommend a high frequency of testing as a best practice. But I'm not so sure I'd like to see anything more specific established. One reason is that we'd all be doing the same thing the same way, and innovation could get derailed. And any needed change down the road would be that much harder to accomplish because, well, this is the standard. And so we risk something by stepping outside of the standard. Another reason is, and I admit it's selfish, I don't want to miss out on the fun of dribbling a little more paint on my painting to see if that makes the outcome more beautiful. For me, that's one of the many joys of teaching, the playing around, the experimentation. I know that when we're looking for guidance, when we want some reassurance that what we're doing in our own course is okay, we want to be able to look up the right answer somewhere. It's really uncomfortable not really knowing for sure. But we do have some guidance, right? For example, HAPS has that set of learning outcomes, and they have the HAPS exam, and those can help guide us. But even these are not meant to be standards, really. They're just tools to help us see if we're on the right track or not, to help us spot areas where our students might be weak, and then decide whether that's really something that even needs to be in our course. Maybe they don't need that concept in our specific program, or maybe they'll be learning that in a different course in our program. And after all, there's no tool, even those tools, that are perfect. And don't forget, and I think this is really potent, we have colleagues in our professional network, in organizations like HAPS and AAA and APS and all kinds of other organizations. And we have the community of listeners and contributors to this podcast and other podcasts and other media who can give us ideas or act as sounding boards. Now, before I finally shut up about this, I want to remind new listeners that in some of the early episodes, I describe more fully how I implement online tests and what happened when I started making all my tests cumulative. I have links to those early episodes in the show notes and at the episode page at theapprofessor.org. So now that Krista has put this question about test frequency out there. An important and interesting question that we A&P teachers really should be thinking and talking about with each other. Let's hear from more of you. What's your answer? What's worked for you? What have you tried and didn't work so well? Just call the podcast hotline at 1-833-546-6336. That's 1-833-LION-DEN. Or record something on your phone and email it to podcast@theapprofessor.org.
The A&P Professor is hosted by Kevin Patton, professor, blogger, and textbook author in human anatomy and physiology.
No pesticides or herbicides were used in the production of this episode.